Hi, my name's Jennifer, and I'm going to describe the difference between effective size versus allocated size and the difference between function call and function headers for 1D arrays and 2D arrays. So here, if I declare an integer array like this, and I put an array size of 4 in the brackets, that is going to become the allocated size because I've allocated 4 spots in memory for values to go into. But if I only fill the array with 2 values like this, only the first 2 indexes are full, then the effective size of this array becomes 2, while the allocated size is 4. If I wanted to traverse this array to find like the maximum integer in the array, then I would not want to loop through the entire array, like through the entire allocated size, because that would waste memory. I only want to loop through the effective size, so it's important to keep track of that. Here I've written a function call for a 1D array. So when I pass in the array, I only need to pass in the name of the array, and that's going to give the address of the first element in the array. When I make my parameter for that array, I'm going to write it just like how I've declared it over here with the type is integer and it's an array with brackets. But I don't need to put anything in these brackets because I'm going to pass in the address of the first element in the array. It doesn't matter how long it is, and you can check that with effective size versus allocated size. In the 2D array, it's the same thing. I pass in the name of the array right here. I've declared an array over here, and the name is going to give the address of the first element right here at index 0 in the column and the row. But when I take it as a parameter, I can write it like how it's been declared over here. It's an integer array. The 2 sets of brackets means that it is 2-dimensional. But I can leave the first one empty, the first set of brackets, just like for a 1D array. But for the second set of brackets, I need to put the number of columns in each row. So here's the columns, and this side's the row. Because when I pass in the address of the first element in the array, I'm going to traverse it inside of this function. But I need to know when to go to the next row, or the computer needs to know. So you just have to tell them how many columns are in each row, and then they know when to change this value when traversing. Okay, here's my code. I'm going to show that it compiles right here. So everything compiled nicely and it's running now. I'm gonna choose option 1 twice and then choose option 2 to display and show all the error messages. So first, I'm gonna add a student. The range is supposed to be 1 to 50, so I'm gonna try something out of range. And there's the error message saying to put something in between 1 and 50. So this time I'm gonna put the right value. The midterm grade is supposed to be between 0 and 100. So I'm gonna try something like 101. And it says it's out of range and tells you what value you need to put in. So I'm going to put something valid. And then for the final, the same thing. If I put like -1, it's going to show an error. I'm going to put a valid one now. So I'm going to add another student by pressing 1. This time I'm going to try to do the same student ID number as before. And there's an error saying that's a duplicate ID and to try another one. So I'm going to put a valid one this time. And we already checked the range errors on them, so I'm just going to put valid numbers now. So I'm going to do 70 and 80. And now I'm going to press 2 to display all of the information. So when I press 2, it shows the class. I labeled it CIS 66. Shows the student ID, the midterm score, the final score, and the grade. And if you look up here, I put in 12, 80, 100. So here you see 12, 80, 100. And for the second student, I put 40, 70, 80. 40, 70, 80 is here. The average of 80 and 100 is a 90, so an A is expected, like we see here. And the average of 70 and 80 is a 75, so that's a C. So that's all working as expected. The last thing I forgot to show is that when you put in a number to the menu, it only takes 1 or 2. So if I put something like 3, it says the number has to be 1 or 2. If I put -1, it has to be 1 or 2. So there's no way you could choose an option that isn't 1 or 2. I have the main function first, which means that all of my function prototypes are up here and my functions are defined under main. So I'm gonna start with main. As you can see, I create the array that stores all the student information here. It's a 5 by 3 array for a maximum of 5 students. That's what's allocated. But I also declared an integer for the number of students in the array, so I can keep track of the effective size and loop through that instead of the allocated size. So this loop is going to continuously display the menu until option 2 is chosen, which is the quit option, or the maximum students has been reached. So I have the while here. It keeps track of the choice. So the choice is you get the choice from menu, and then we call the option function with that choice. But at the bottom, the while loop is supposed to terminate when the choice equals 2 or quit. But with each loop, we also check if the maximum number of students has been reached. If it has, we're going to force the choice to be 2, and we're going to display all the information, and then the do while is going to end. And that's the end of the program. So the next function we have under that is range check, which is going to be called whenever we take an input when we want to check if it's within range. So we call it with that input value, we put in a minimum and a maximum, and it's going to return true if the input is within that range, and it's going to return false if the input is not in the range, and it's going to output an error message telling you what the range is and to try again. So all the other functions are going to reprompt if there's an error. So we also have duplicate check. So both of these are Boolean because it returns true or false. Duplicate check will return true if the student ID number that's been input, this is the parameter for the input, is a duplicate. So it's going to traverse through the array and it's going to use this number students, which means it's going to traverse like the effective size of the array to check if there's a duplicate out of all the IDs that have already been put in. If there is, it's going to output an error message telling you what's wrong, and it's going to return true, and then the function it returns to is going to reprompt. And if it's not a duplicate, it's going to return false. So these functions are used the most in this function, which is CIS66. This function gets the ID, the midterm grade, and the final grade from the user. And if they successfully get valid input for each of those, they're going to add it in down here. So for student ID, there's a loop that takes in the student ID. It's going to check if the student ID is a duplicate with this condition, and it's going to check if it's within range. And if it is, then it's a valid input, so it's going to end the loop. It's going to set valid to true. So I've defined valid up here to be false before each loop, and I reuse it for every check. So here, if the student ID is valid, it's going to end this loop, set valid to true, but then we're going to reset valid to false and start another loop to get a valid midterm grade. And it's going to check that the midterm grade is in range. And if it is, then valid is true again. And then we do it again for the final grade, the same process as the midterm grade. They have the same range. I put in the range values here, as you can see, for each of them. And then if we get successful inputs, then finally we can add all the students' information in. I've realized that number of students during this loop is going to be equal to the row that this student's information is going to go in, because number of students is going to be the number of students that have been successfully added in. So the first student, as we go through this loop, number of students equals 0. So it's adding all of this information to the very first row. And then at the very end, we increment number of students. So about this increment down here, we do it at the very end so that the index is correct for these when you add it in. And also, I had some trouble with it before because I was just passing number of students without the ampersand before. But up here, you see I have an ampersand now. I realized I had to add that there so that it can pass the location and memory of this variable and actually change it within here instead of creating a copy. And I realized that since I was passing number of students through multiple functions, I had to pass the original address from the main function through any intermediate functions too, or else it's going to make a copy and just pass the address of the copy in here. So I got that figured out. I put ampersands where I needed to. Here's letter grade. It's going to be used at the end to take the average of the midterm and the final and convert it to a letter score. So it takes the average here. The index is given by the display function at the end, and it's just gonna access the information for that student from these columns. So this is the midterm column, this is the final column, 1 and 2. Take the average, and then it's gonna use an if and else if and check like each range, check if the average is within each of these ranges, and then return the proper letter score for it. So it's just going to return a character, A, B, C, D, or F for the grade. Display is the one that calls that. So display is used when the program quits or reaches the maximum number of students and quits. So it's going to, this top part is for the formatting. It's going to have the student ID, midterm, final, and grade as we saw at the end when we displayed it. And this loop is going to access each row and number of students and then print out the column, like each value for each column in that row. And so here is the student ID number. This is the midterm grade. This is the final grade at 2. And then the letter grade is going to be calculated last. And it's going to call that letter grade function and then print the result here. So that's how we show all the information at the end. This is the menu function, which will loop and display the menu over and over and get input until a valid input is entered. And the input's going to be the choice of 1 or 2. So when a valid input is entered, it's going to return that at the end. And then option, so menu and option are both called in the main function. Option is going to take the choice that is returned from menu, and it's going to, according to which choice is chosen, call the proper function for it. So if choice 1 is chosen, it's going to call CIS66 to add another student to the array. And if choice 2 is chosen, that means it's going to quit. So it's going to display all the information before it quits and ends the program. And then there's this wrong option that I included just in case like some other choice gets in there, and it's gonna say that there's an error and then return, but it probably won't ever get there. So I just want to look at all the functions again at the parameters and note just a couple of these are going to have the number of students with an ampersand because they need to either keep passing along the address of number of students or just or they have to do that and alter it. So that's why some of these have ampersands and some of these don't, because they don't need to pass along the address and they also don't need to change the value. The array is passed in for any of the functions that need to traverse it and access information from it. And these arrays are going to pass in the address of that array. So there's no ampersand needed. You are able to modify it within the functions.